We're going to talk about what in our field is called comorbid or co-occurring, which is co-occurring is sort of like this attempt at bettering comorbid factors in psychology or diagnosis or, God, what a horrible word, comorbid. I can remember learning that word in grad school, and I was like, yeah, but morbid means you're dead. So what does that really mean?
Well, and I think about obesity.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I don't know why my mind immediately goes to obesity. And I'm like, well, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, the thought is that there are all kinds of things that people are, dual is another word we use, dual diagnosis, which to me, it means two. So if there's more than two, you're out of the, I'm so literalist. It's no dual anymore. Now it's like, what would the word even be? It'd be like trice and quattro or whatever.
Well, but do you know how many diagnoses people carry?
Oh yeah, people. Yeah.
That's when you know. That's when you know you're like, oh, there's, wait, have we started?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We've actually started recording.
Yeah. Haven't we? You're doing the recording. Yeah. I think we should keep this in there. I've had so many students that I've supervised over the years that have had clients that are like in community mental health or in the prison systems, and they have like 10 diagnoses.
Oh, I know.
Typically what's going on there is there's misdiagnoses, and they just keep adding them. And the people that are adding them never go back and look at the file to see what other diagnoses do these people have, and they just tag another one on. And so that's what we mean by comorbid, co-occurring, more than one diagnosis, right? Now, we're not saying that there's never not more than one diagnosis, because sometimes, like, autism and ADHD.
Yeah.
I see that all the time.
Yeah.
But I think what we really want to talk about today, and what made us think about this was a comment from one of our viewers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Love you.
About misdiagnosis specifically. Here, I have a pen mark on my palm, and I'm totally like, ooh, shiny. I'm not very focused today.
Do you need to remove it?
I'm totally unfocused today. All right. Okay. Back to what I was talking about. This idea of misdiagnosis oftentimes happens when people, especially when they're assigned more than one diagnosis. And I got a lot of training around, if you get someone that comes in to see you that has a previous diagnosis, particularly if there's more than one, don't just take it at face value. It may be a misdiagnosis. It may be that they've developed out of it or into it or whatever. It's no longer a diagnosis. And more importantly, there are other diagnoses that sort of supersede these other ones that are underneath it, right? And then really a lot of people aren't diagnosing correctly. Like I've seen people get post-traumatic stress disorder diagnoses a month after exposure to a stress. And if you look at the DSM or the ICD, you can't give PTSD until at minimum the 3-month mark, and it's usually about the 6-month mark. So there's all kinds of stuff that people get labeled with that are incorrect or can be subsumed under something else, right? So I think of like neurodiversity, even though being neurodivergent isn't a diagnosis, if I have somebody who comes into my office who's been saddled with a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, or what we're seeing more now, especially older people, older meaning like older, over 30, right?
Oh my God.
Not a young adult anymore, because they would have been diagnosed at a time that was different.
Yeah, for sure.
Bipolar disorder, right?
Bipolar.
All kinds of, there's different kinds of bipolar disorder. Even PTSD I've seen where it's really been more about something else, or like complex trauma. Someone's diagnosed with all these things. It's like, you're really not supposed to give a bipolar or a borderline personality disorder diagnosis to someone who's got complex trauma, right? Because complex trauma explains it all better. And then you look at to me, the way I was trained is then the things that are feeding into those other diagnoses are really about behaviors that person's adopted to try to cope.
Yep.
So if I just saddle them with a borderline personality disorder and I, get them into DBT versus resolving the trauma, some of those behaviors tend to go away naturally, right? I had complex trauma when I first got into therapy in my 20s. I was starting to get super OCD-ish, like I was checking doorknobs and things like that, and spent about a 2-year period where I was full-blown anorexic in hindsight. My therapist never used those words. Thank God she was a really good therapist. Started addressing the trauma. Those things completely resolved like naturally. And I've never, knock on wood, have never gone back to them. Had she just drilled into those straightforwardly, I think I would have just felt shamed and it wouldn't have felt like it really scratched the itch that was really itching. And I may have dropped out of therapy. So it's not just like we're criticizing people by saying, oh, you misdiagnosed. I mean, it does happen probably more often than we want it to. But the treatment isn't correct then. That's why it's so important to have the concept of it correctly. Whenever I have people come into my office and they're really interested in a diagnosis, and I say, okay, we can do that. We sort of have to do that if we want to bill insurance, but I'm going to talk to you about it. And I'm not going to know after 3 sessions everything about you. So we may end up modifying it just so you're open to it. And they're like, oh, okay. It's a little different than, a blood test and you do or don't have a white cell count elevation, right? We have to get more information and we could maybe give some tests to jibe some of that, but we can't really do that, right? So it takes some time. But there are so many people that have been diagnosed as bipolar and borderline specifically that are really neurodivergent. And especially people that are my age or your age who didn't grow up with this idea knowing about neurodivergence are having these massive aha moments. Like, oh, wait a minute. I'm not bipolar at all. I can get off my medication. I'm not advocating go off your medication without supervision, but I'm seeing this over and over and over. I don't know about you.
I am. And, I see bipolar a lot actually as, especially women who come to my practice as adults or young adults. And the bipolar, they're like, oh, before I understood my brand of autism or my ADHD, everyone thought I was bipolar. And I think, what's so tough about bipolar and borderline is I feel like they're quite pathological in their connotation and the way that people understand them. You never hear like, oh, congratulations, you're married to a borderline. I mean, like, no, like,
right.
That's just not the case. Yeah. And I think that
big stigma, right?
There's a huge stigma surrounding it. And what I think what we've said on the show multiple times is that we are a product of our cumulative experiences. The way that we have come to cope or compensate for the life that we live in this world. And for some, living in this world is hard because as one of our NeuroMarvels say, normies. When you're not a normie, it's so cute. When you're not a normie, right? It's hard. It's a hard place to live in because of a bunch of factors. But I think when you start getting saddled with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 diagnoses, what we're really talking about here is complexity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It reminds me of like sometimes medication where a psychiatrist will chase just the symptoms of one medication with another medication.
Right.
And now we've got all of these medications going on for a person when we really haven't kind of taken a look at what each medication is doing because I understand it to be very complex. Yeah. But understanding someone's, again, that question, how does this behavior make sense?
Yes, exactly.
When you can understand that question, then you can work with someone to heal because it's usually, especially I think in the borderline aspect, like that diagnosis reflects complex trauma.
Oh yeah, trying to figure out a way to get through the world and protect yourself before you get hurt because you've been hurt over and over and over. Yeah.
Right, because your primary relationships early on have been abusive, neglectful. I mean, and I'm not even saying that was necessarily intentional, even though I think when we see our classic our classic right borderlines, we can see very, very disturbing early kind of relationships. So, this co-occurring, Dana and I,
or stacked, because people have 7 or 8 diagnoses.
It's like, does one diagnosis, I guess the way I think about this as a clinician is, does the adding of the diagnosis help to support the person? So some of the times in my mind, it's like, okay, let's say we start with an autism diagnosis, right? And the autism diagnosis, I think, already reflects that there's complexity in a person, right? There's a lot that's happening neurologically for that person. Let's say we add the ADHD diagnosis to this. In my mind, that makes sense clinically when that person's real struggle in the world is attention-based. And we can talk about, there's so many different types of attentional issues, executive functioning issues, impulse control, distractibility, all of those things that make up attention. When that's kind of more front and center, like, it makes sense to me to add.
And if you need that for, like you said, to implement treatment or support, right?
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah.
Like I'll talk about with people, and my wife can attend to this, identifying as somewhat hyperkinetic. Like, I have a hard time staying in one place for a long time, even if it's just like to go into the kitchen to get something and come back. I'm not ADHD. I don't have those seminal attention issues. I've done testing. I've actually tried a course of medication 20 years ago, and I'm just not ADHD, but I have a component of it, that hyperness, but it's not attention, right? But the layperson would say, oh, you're so ADHD. It's like, oh, dude, don't throw that around when A, you don't know what really goes into it, and B, how would you treat it, right? So for me, how do you treat hyperactivity? Is my hyperkineticness something that needs to be treated? Used to kind of drive my parents crazy, but I think it really is just who I am. It's just as much part of me as anything else, and I just learned to live with it, right? And I use it in ways that are nice to me or that work well for me, but it isn't something to be extinguished, right? And more importantly, it isn't something to be treated, so I wouldn't get that label. So that's what's so important too. And sometimes splitting those hairs takes some time and takes expertise, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to add another diagnosis on. That's simple.
Yeah, this lazy.
Yeah.
It's just kind of like a lazy thing.
Yeah.
Dana, I love that you brought up, this example for yourself, because the way that I would think about it for you is it's part of your sensory profile.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
More than an attentional thing, right? So it's like my body feels the most comfortable when I'm in movement.
Right.
Which is why, like, some of your hobbies that you have are very movement focused. They're very movement based. And that makes a lot of sense to me because it feels good to move your body.
Yeah. Yep.
It's regulating for you to do so. And so why would we ever treat that when it's regulating? Yeah. And so this is why it's like, how does this make sense? That question alone, it just really helps to, I think, pause and stop and think about, where does this come from?
Yeah. Yep.
So,
I think it's that conforming and being normie. I mean, I can think about that. I think we've talked about that that visual that's in classrooms where, you're sitting still and your hands are down and you're looking ahead, and it's like, oh God, a lot of kids can't do that. They can't have quiet hands, and, sort of the pushback we're seeing for that now. But most importantly, I think for adults who do finally get the right answers, it's so incredibly life transforming, because now they finally understand themselves. They finally, it's not like everything melts away. There's a whole adjustment to a diagnosis of being neurodiverse, but now it makes sense. Like I said before, what makes sense? Now I can do things or ask for things that do help and do work, right? So if I'm really neurodivergent and I'm labeled borderline, there aren't really any treatments like in school for a borderline person other than being marginalized and judged. But if it's really that I'm ADHD or neurodivergent in some way or whatever it is, then I can have my needs met that way. I can get accommodations for those. I think of accommodations as like treatment as well, part of a treatment plan. Yeah.
Yeah. And that treatment is a choice. Mm-hmm. Like, it's because that person is like, gosh, this is kind of a barrier to something mm-hmm. that means something to me. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do I lean into that? This idea of compliance based training and being quote unquote normal. We really just have to be really careful about this. We've spoken it before. It's masking. Yeah, it's masking. And we're asking someone to be very uncomfortable. And don't get me wrong. I don't condone stims that are unhealthy and dangerous because those exist. Yeah, we all know that those exist. Those need to be addressed. But I'm talking about flapping your hands or shaking your feet or some of these things that are not really, they're not interrupting things.
Even picking my cuticles that I do and my thumbs have ridges in them from them. That's the one I think I've mentioned on here before. It's it does cause some damage sometimes when I go too far, but you know what? It's okay. I have nippers in my backpack all the time and I have plenty of Band-Aids. And it's the one thing that I've tried to extinguish, but it really is regulating for me.
Yeah.
So why I have to take that away rather than just always have the things you need with you to take care of it if you make it bleed. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so funny. If I'm doing a session with a young adult or a teen with their parent and I can always see, where a parent might say, no, you need to sit here. You need to look at the screen. You need to da-da-da-da-da, right? And I'm like, listen, the important thing to me is that this session feels productive for this person.
Yeah.
If they need to go to the bathroom or they're thinking about oh my gosh, I didn't put in that last thing on my Lego, blah, 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 or my puzzle. And I'm like, go finish it.
Yeah, exactly.
Close the loop.
Yep.
Come back. Yep. Because that's going to free you to be here.
That's right.
Versus be so taken with this thought.
Oh, let it go and don't do it and stop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's so, it's always it's always this kind of cost and what it costs people. And to really think about things in that way, that it's not just black and white. But it's funny because, parents usually want them to look a certain way in a meeting. And I'm like, I don't even care that the camera's on. I listen, and so come as you are. And I just find the session becomes so much more meaningful and productive for that person because they can truly focus on the things that they really want to work on. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. I love what you said too, because you said a parent will say, I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And even that language, and I did a TikTok video recently about kind of an object relations idea of merging, unhealthy merging. And even the language, you can unpack that. Instead of saying, I need you to do this, if you make the parent change it to, I want you to do that. Oh, now they know it's really their thing and not kids, right?
I make their parents do an I statement.
Yeah.
When that happens, so I'll be like, let's identify the feeling on that. And it's when you don't act a certain way, I feel whatever.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed or I'm worried or whatever it is.
Yep. And we just really, really lean into whose responsibility and whose emotions are at play here that's motivating this behavior. So I don't know. There are often times where I feel I'm on the brink of being fired, either by a parent or a client. But this is what comes par for the course.
You should always be on that edge in that situation. Yeah, exactly.
I think, kind of back to having a laundry list of diagnoses, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what this says is, wow, do you fit? What is that? Yeah. Are you the square peg? You're not the square peg that's fitting in the round hole or whatever. There is complexity to you. How does it make sense to you?
Yes. Yeah.
Work with someone to understand that.
Yeah. And that's what's great about certain types of training. I mean, if you get training where it's all about the labeling and it's, the hardcore ABA or CBT where they're just interested in the behavior and shaping the behavior. We're more complex than that. So the training is better. And specifically, I've mentioned this in here before, my learning training is we do the labels because we have to for insurance and they're blah, blah, blah. But I want to know why. What makes sense? What is driving this person? Why are they doing what they're doing? Or they wouldn't be doing it. So get in there and figure out, what is the whys. And that can even be the case for when I have people who come to me with a bipolar diagnosis and they say, I've been on medication for years and I'm regulated. And I'm like, well, all bipolar medications just kind of snow you a little bit. So they would just mute no matter what's there. And I don't, I'm not a medical doctor, so I don't yank them off medication. But I just say, let's just be open to looking at that and seeing what else is in there, not to just see the whole picture. And that's not to say I haven't had clients that really are border bipolar and do well on meds.
Yeah.
Because that's a thing for sure.
Yep.
But looking at it and what else is going on and what makes sense, I've had that experience too, where I've had people who had a misdiagnosis and then their world changes when it gets corrected. Right. And don't we all just really deserve that as humans?
Yeah.
And the analogy, if you think about having in your medical record, if you had a misdiagnosis, like if someone said you had MS and you didn't, wouldn't you want to have that be correct? Well, you'd be getting some sort of treatment that's really not what you should be getting.
Yeah.
But so transferring that medical model over to psychology, which is sort of what has happened, has some structure, but it really has a limited point because we have to look at how things are moving around and make sure we get them right. Because it's not a disease state that we're identifying with a blood test. It's a way of being, and that takes some time to unpack.
Absolutely. A way of thinking, a way of being, a way of your self-knowledge and how you relate to yourself. I mean, like these are big things.
Yeah.
And it's sad to me. I mean, there's a few realities of our profession. And one is that the money in our society revolves around a biomedical model.
Yep.
And that's just not something insurance, right. Yep. So there needs to be something pathologically wrong with you in order to get anything. And so just that function alone. Yeah. If you don't have a psychologist or a practitioner or someone that's like, okay, that's we got to play by that in order for you to have access. Now let's really understand it. So for Dana and I don't know if they still do this, Dana, you can let me know if they still do, but as psychologists, as a psychologist, I was trained to have a biopsychosocial, more of a biopsychosocial model to understand a person and to see and help them understand. Yeah. We still teach that because there's so much more than just biomedical.
That's right.
Yep. So for those of you that are, have multiple diagnoses, carry multiple diagnoses, that don't understand your diagnoses, are like, what is that really?
Never seem to fit. Yeah.
Work with someone to understand what your brand is. I say that, even autism, right?
Yeah.
What's your brand of autism? Because it's different.
That's right. Exactly.
It's different. And so how do we understand that? And I think this is why, this neurodivergent umbrella is so lovely, because what it captures is neurological differences that are fine, that are expected in our population, that are that's not a disease or something to fix or cure. So hey, Dana, I'll end this episode with this. Dana and I have been considering making merch with different phrases. If you think that that's a good idea, let us know in the comments.
Yeah.
We're curious. And look how flexible we are. We didn't even start our podcast, our episode today the way we usually do.
Yeah. I love laughing into a podcast.
Laughing into? just laughing into the pod. As Dana and I usually laugh into the podcast, we actually, their only time that the audience has seen what we do before a podcast is when I made those mistakes with my editing. That's the only time you guys have had a peek into the beginning of a podcast before I hit the cut button.
And we try to have a straight face to have a.
It's awful.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah.
It's ridiculous. We just may dump that.
I think it's good that we're breaking the mold with our dual diagnosis podcast because it just seems to fit. Let's break the rules.
Yeah. And and Dana, what should be like, let's just tell people like, we don't want to do co-occurring. We don't want to do dual diagnosis. We don't want to do comorbid.
No.
Because it's just not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
it's just like,
what in the world?
Like, to borrow from that book, it's about what job you would get, but it's what color is my parachute. I kind of like that because you said like everybody's is different. You know, what is your brand?
What's your brand?
Yep.
What's your brand? All right, everyone. We will see you in the next episode. Thank you so much for being here. Bye.
All right. Be good to you.